Hello and welcome to Identity Leathercraft. I want to talk today about casing the leather and what that means and when to use it. Sometimes we need to get the leather a bit softer for reasons for our project. This might be to stamp into it with veg tan, it might be to do carving and tooling, it might be for folding over a belt loop to set a buckle in, it could be for a knife sheath. We just want that leather to have that bit of malleability without being totally wet. The idea is not to soak the leather with water because that can make it stretch and become too malleable. It's just about having an easing and a sense of forming. So typically you might come across the expression for casing with regard to tooling. This is the difference between just putting a sponge with water or spray on your leather. So I don't know how much this will show, but I've just sponged this one. Now you can see there that are different areas where it's not gone in massively evenly, and as it's beginning to dry back it's much more noticeable. So if I was to be doing lots of tooling across this whole area, what I might find is that I'm doing some stamping and tooling across and I'm getting a nice definition of the contrast of the stamp, and then I get to a place where the leather's a different humidity, different moisture content, and it looks different even though I'm using the same pressure and moving along. So how can I get round that? If you're just using it for a quick stamp, then this method with the sponge or using a spray mister is absolutely fine, but I would always say leave it for at least a couple of minutes. It would depend on the conditions of the room you're in, but what you want to do before you put any impression in is to wait for it to get back, sort of dry back a bit like these colours. So the idea is that the moisture content is seeping down into the leather, so that when you do any incisions or any kind of embossing down, you're going at least of a third in thicker leather, going down into the leather so that you're getting that contrast. So the way that you would case it, and the expression of casing, is basically putting them into a Ziploc bag, pressing all the air out and putting them in the fridge. So the idea of this is a minimum of half an hour. The leather water content disperses through the leather more evenly and you end up with something that's got this very sort of perfect kind of malleability for tooling into. So if I take one of these out that I did earlier, see if I can find one that's a bit thicker for contrast. Here we go. So if I grab I haven't got a swivel knife handy, but I'll just grab my awl and do an incision. I'll do it in this drier piece. That's one pressure. You can hardly see it on there. But if I do it on this damper piece, using the same pressure, it's gone in a lot deeper. You can see a lot more of a contrast. That's because the leather moisture is much more willing and to be open and to be stamped. So if I do a stamp into that now, warning, I'm hitting loudly. You should be able to see that pretty clearly, and you've got a much more even stamp finish, and you've got the nice contrast darkness showing through. So that gives you casing the leather. So a Ziploc bag, perfect for veg tan. You spray the leather, dampen it with a sponge, either way, put it into the bag and leave it for as long as you can. Our tutor David likes to even leave them for a few hours, and I've known people to leave them overnight. The other advantage to it is that you can maybe just remist your leather if you're halfway through working on a complicated piece, put it back, put it into the fridge, go and have your lunch, and then you can work on it again in the afternoon. So just a useful way to get the humidity even in your leather. The other time you might want to use it is what I would call easing, which is a bit of a sewing term, but I was making leather tankards, and the circular base going into the tube of the tankard it was quite tricky to get that base to kind of line up and get in how I wanted it to. So I just wet the edges with a sponge on the grain side and on the flesh side, left it for about 20 minutes, and then I sewed it, and it just gave me that softness where I could get the seams and the stitch holes matching up and made it much easier to sew through. Again, you can use that same technique if you've got a particularly hard piece of leather, a compressed piece, or just a very thick leather. It might make it easier for you to get a cut through into the leather. So by letting the moisture content raise, it would make the cutting action much easier. You just have to avoid not getting anything too wet in this instance because you don't want to have any stretching. The other technique is for what I would call tricky leathers. So leathers maybe that have been got a finish of some sort on, so they might have a wax finish like this bridle leather. It has a sort of very smooth finish look on the back, and it has this very sort of characteristic wax on the top. This is our navy bridle, which is on the website. It's absolutely beautiful colour, and this is the thinner thickness. I'm making some of this into a Midori journal, and I want to be able to have a bended fold that stays so that the notebook stays shut. At the moment, this, you can see, this is just kind of stiff, and it's not going to give me that kind of fold. So I've got a piece that's been in overnight in a bag of dampened sawdust. So you can do this in a box or a Ziploc bag again. Any sawdust, you can get it from pet shops, or if you're a woodworker or if you know a woodworker, then save your sawdust, keep it into a box or a bag, and if you mis-spray it, get the water in, stir it all up with your hands, get the moisture content through all the sawdust so the sawdust is damp without being wet. So you maybe leave it 10 minutes, kind of work it out, and then put your piece of leather into the centre of the sawdust and leave it overnight. So I've got some in here that I'm going to take out. I'm going to take out, I think, see if I can take out the big piece without making a huge mess. There we go. Got some smaller pieces in there which will become my ties. So I'm just going to brush it off a little bit. Now this has got a beautiful kind of malleability about it, so just check which is the top side. So I want to push this over for my Midori cover. I'll just make sure I've got it lined up straight before I set any bends in it. So this method is great for making knife sheaths, using the bridle leather and getting it to do what you want it to do. It's just a really good method for softening where leathers have got a finish. You can use it on the firm calf leather as well. Now you'll see immediately that's taken the bend. So it's not altered any of the other characteristics of the leather. It's been very gentle way. It's not wet it. It's not going to affect the wax finish on the top. It's just given me that extra flexibility to be able to get the bend into that leather. So that's the sawdust method. The other method I just want to run through with you is something that can work for calf leathers in chrome tanned or mineral tanned leather. So this is a piece of the firm calf, which is one of our workbench remnants from the shoe industry, the UK shoe industry, and I'm making this into a folded pouch. So I need to set creases in this in order to get my folds to stay and to fold neatly to give me my pouch edge. This is the inside section, so I'll use it on this. So the way I do this is I work out where I want my fold line to be, and using a ruler. If you're using a thinner leather, you can just use an awl and you gently score maybe 3-4 times to create a score line for your fold. If you're using a thicker leather, you're going to need to do a thicker channel. So you can either use the freehand groover and pull out a channel in the leather, or a V-gouge, something along those lines. And sometimes I actually do use my edge beveler, but press down straight rather than using the angle, and that gives me a nice channel. So the reason we do that is if you imagine that you've got a thicker leather and you're trying to make a box or a bag out of the thick leather, when you're going to this degree of it, you've got leather in the way here, and it affects the way that the leather curves here, and sometimes you get an unpleasant creasing. So if you've taken a channel out and thinned that down, you're allowing that angle some space to sit neatly. So that's the reason we do that when we're doing it. The next stage for setting a crease in is to paint the line with water. I don't know why I picked black, because it doesn't, if I do that you can just see. Okay, so I'm just going to leave that to kind of soak in for a minute or two, and I'll show you these I've done on the oil tanned leathers. So this is the crease in it. So this is what the leather's like normally. This is the leather we use on the bag making workshop to make the messenger bag. So I've scored this, wet it, and then I folded it over and I've rubbed it with the bone folder, which I've put away. If I press that down, you can see you've got a good ridge going on there. Now because that leather was wet and then has dried, it's kind of set that fold and that crease, so you can see it quite sharply there, so you get a nice sharp crease in the leather. So I'll go back to this one now. This doesn't need particularly long, but because you're putting the moisture onto the flesh side where you've got fibres that are more open and willing to accept it, even though this has got a finished surface, I can bring that moisture content back up. Using this method, I have actually managed to successfully emboss and stamp onto this calf leather, even though it's heavily finished and even though it's not vegetable tanned. Some of the calf leathers are part veg, part chrome, part mineral. This one is a chrome leather, but sometimes it's worth taking a little experiment. Stick it in overnight into some sawdust, get the moisture content up and give it a go, see if it will take a stamp. So that's given me that nice creased edge now. Hope you can see that. Okay, so we've got a much sharper, much more defined crease without damaging the leather and just using those techniques. So I hope that that's helped, and I hope you find that useful. And if you've got any questions, do mail them in to mail@theidentitystore.co.uk. And do check out any of those tools or any of the leathers mentioned. They're on our website, www.identityleathercraft.com. Thanks so much for watching. Bye!